Hey, Bookends! Welcome to somewhat of a check-in, I guess. I'm 10. Hopefully we have a review coming for you next week, hopefully. Right now I'm just kind of sitting here in bed making masks, because that's a thing now. So I'm trying to make masks to donate. So some of you might be feeling a little bit overwhelmed, right? Because of this whole coronavirus, COVID-19, nothing like this has happened in modern history, and all of that loveliness. And you have every right to feel overwhelmed. Sometimes, or at least I have found, looking back on history, to see that you're not the only one, and that this stuff like this happened before, and that we can get through it again, is the best medicine, or at least that's what I find sometimes. So I was going through my iPhone, pardon me, and I found some video from a convention or seminar, seminar lecture in regards to the infectious disease history of Newark, New Jersey. It was given by the Newark, New Jersey Historical Society, and I was so graciously invited because of being a part of 10-minute book reviews. So that was wonderful. I never got a chance to edit the footage, but I figure now is a pretty good time to share this. It's going to be a very long video, about 40-something minutes, but it is helpful. It talks about the flu epidemic in Newark, New Jersey, and it also talks about the polio epidemic in Newark, New Jersey. And it really was an eye-opener, and it kind of tells why vaccinations are important, even though this isn't a video to shame anti-vaxxers or anything like that. I hope that when you watch this, you'll see that yes, we go through periods of bad times. Yes, there will be losses in the way of life and mobility, and that there will be life changes. But things eventually go back to normal, or there becomes a new normal, because that happens. There can be a new normal. But despite that new normal, things will even out. We'll no longer be making masks. We'll be using the leftover fabric to make something else. Maybe bow ties. Or maybe masks will become stylish and we'll keep wearing them even after the epidemic is over because, or pandemic I should say, because it's all over the world. Epidemic is in one place, pan is everywhere. So maybe we'll wear them as fashion statements instead. Who knows? But one day this will all be over. And hopefully this video will help give you some perspective into what it was like when our parents and grandparents were going through something similar, and how they got through it, and how we can get through it too. So, without further ado, may I present to you the lecture on infectious diseases hosted by the Newark, New Jersey Historical Society and presented at the NJPAC Center for Performing Arts.
Tonight about the 1918 influenza pandemic, in particular how it pertained to Newark under the auspices of its mayor, Charles Gillen, who played politics with disease. Now, just to put the influenza pandemic in perspective, I want to compare some numbers to the Great War, which was also occurring at the same time. And so, for example, 40 to 100 million people died of influenza, and we will worldwide, and we will never know the actual numbers because physicians were so busy caring for the sick. And influenza wasn't even a reportable disease in most countries, including the United States, until October of that year. Now, 11 million soldiers, 7 million civilians died in the Great War, also very staggering numbers. 675,000 Americans died of influenza versus 116,000 American soldiers who died in the Great War. 22,000 New Jerseyans died of influenza versus 3,400 New Jersey soldiers. And nearly 2,200 Newarkers died during the 1918 influenza pandemic versus 255 Newark soldiers. And when I saw that number, it raised a little bit of a red flag with me as I began my research about the influenza pandemic in New Jersey. About 10% of the deaths that occurred in New Jersey occurred in Newark. Now, influenza was first reported in New Jersey at Camp Dix. From September 15th of 1918 to September 26th, there were over 4,000 cases of influenza. By October 21st, there were over 7,000 cases of influenza, resulting in 863 deaths. The influenza was so widespread that they had to convert barracks into field hospitals. Now, in my research about New Jersey, that I found that overall, New Jersey had an infrastructure of people in place to handle the influenza pandemic professionally and effectively. For example, in the New Jersey State Board of Health had a publication known as Public Health News. And the State Board of Health kept physicians apprised of what was happening around the state. So they talked about the onset of the disease, the viability of vaccines or lack thereof, and how to treat this disease. And they kept physicians constantly informed through this publication. Communities throughout the state, such as Camden, Princeton, and New Brunswick, all came together to convert buildings into hospitals and even put their cities under volunteer quarantine. In fact, when the state of New Jersey put the entire state under quarantine, there was 95% compliance among the municipalities, but unfortunately not in Newark. Newark was the anomaly in all of this. And it caused me to ask a question about Mayor Gillen, because he was the one who was really controlling the situation through his actions. And I wondered if he was to blame or somewhat responsible for the largest concentration of deaths in the state due to influenza. Now I want to tell you a little bit about Newark in 1918. It was a very patriotic city. Army enlistment rates were high. The Liberty bonds were oversubscribed. Laborers fabricated freighters round the clock at Newark Bay. In fact, Newark's population was growing and changing. There were many African-American families who had been recruited from the South to work in Newark's factories to take jobs that had been vacated by men who enlisted in the Army. There had also been an explosion at a munitions plant in Morgan, New Jersey. Now, Morgan is near South Amboy, and left several families, hundreds of families, homeless, and many of them were coming into Newark at this time trying to find housing. Now, the first cases of influenza in Newark were reported on September 25th of that year, and Dr. Charles Craster, Newark's health officer, declared that the disease is nothing more than the grip in a somewhat more virulent form than it has been in recent years. So right away, we're starting to see that Dr. Charles Craster is not making much of this sickness and is basically having to take a back seat, because it is not Craster, but Gillen, Mayor Gillen, who would call the shots. It is Mayor Gillen who would end up taking control of Newark's health office. It is Gillen who wanted to show that he had Newark's influenza situation under control, and it's because Gillen wanted the limelight. Now, a little bit more about Charles Gillen. He was born in Roscommon County, Ireland. He emigrated with his parents to the United States during the potato famine. He had made his money in real estate, and many of his cronies wanted to see him in elected office. So he was elected mayor of Newark in 1917 under a new commission form of government. And what that meant is there were 5 positions that people could run for, and the person who received the most votes was the mayor. Now, Gillen chose to become an independent because he thought that he would garner more votes that way, and I guess he was right, even though his parents were staunch Democrats. Anyway, it was interesting about his first few months as mayor. He made sure that there was funding to complete the 12-story Kinney building and the very luxurious Robert Treat Hotel right down the street. Even though it was wartime, he somehow secured that funding and satisfied his many business constituents. But he also had a heart for the working man. For example, one day he decided to board a trolley because he was protesting the trolley company's rate hike increase. And he refused to pay that extra 1-cent fare rate increase. And as a result of his protest, they won. The trolley company backed down. Now, he also ordered the National Guard to erect tents at Valesburg Park to house the homeless, and it was complete with electricity and water, and the area became known as Camp Gillen. Now, he also had an impetuous side to him. On the evening of October 6th, okay, not November, October, he led a parade through Newark city streets, complete with bands and flag bearers, because he had heard through newspaper boys who had shouted that Germany surrendered, Germany has surrendered. So what does Gillen do? He fails to confirm the veracity of this report and leads a parade through the streets anyway, well up until midnight. Well, this type of reactionary behavior would definitely characterize his mayor and how he handled the influenza pandemic. Now, when you first look at Gillen's initial responses to influenza, it seems okay. They actually seem okay, and they are, but I caution that they are his only responses to influenza. So one of the first things he does is he makes influenza a reportable disease, actually before the state had made it a reportable disease. He ordered city workers to hang posters warning of the dangers of the disease. He issued a 4-minute talk. Those are the types of talks that were given right before a movie was shown at a movie theater. He distributed 70,000 warning circulars among children to carry home to their parents. Therefore, schools stayed open, at least for a while. And he converted only one furniture warehouse into a hospital. So, okay, sounds like maybe he's on the right track. But then it changes. Things change. And he says to his Newark health officer, Dr. Charles Crapster, and says to him, you know what, you need to issue some kind of a statement that the control of influenza is really in the hands of the people. Because Gillen's mantra was, the sick should just stay home. And then what Gillen does, remember I told you, you like to be in the limelight. He sent local Red Cross nurses down to Camp Dix to care for the soldiers there who were afflicted with the flu. Right? Now, he basked in this praise that he received for having the foresight and the patriotism to provide for America's soldiers. In the meantime, though, within those few days, Newark had reported over 1,500 cases of influenza. Those Red Cross nurses could have been used in Newark. So on October 8th of 1918, Governor Edge, along with the State Board of Health, put New Jersey under quarantine. And basically what that meant is all places of public assembly were closed. Now the thing is Gillen was a little bit dubious of quarantines because he felt that they applied to the healthy as well as the sick. And basically he thinks quarantines restricted freedom of movement. So Gillen just felt, like I was telling you before, that the sick should just stay home. So what does Gillen do? He issues a modified quarantine. He said restaurants and schools are going to stay open. Okay, why restaurants and schools? Well, people had to eat, of course, right? But often bars were connected to restaurants, and I'll get back to that one. And then he issues this statement with regard to the children and the schools. He says, children would be safer in the schools than they would be permitted to run at large among places where people congregated and where the danger of infection from personal contact is great. Now, eventually, the superintendent of schools, David Corson, would close down the schools, but of course, much to Gillen's chagrin. Now, on the night of October 8th, okay, now Gillen's had a very long day. He saw on his desk that morning that the state was going to put the entire state of New Jersey under quarantine. He also puts out his modified quarantine. So it's been a long day, and he finds himself at the Owl Cafe at around midnight, which was a popular restaurant gathering place in the Roseville section of Newark, right? Now, Gillen had had his dinner, and he spots a couple of acquaintances and their dates, a few tables down, and he orders everybody a round of drinks, right? All of a sudden, Gillen is summoned outside. And out there, outside, he finds his police commissioner and the director of public safety who were waiting for Gillen. And they said to him, since people were at the Owl Cafe at midnight, clearly they're not eating, but only assembling to drink. So what did Police Commissioner McEnroe and Director Brennan do? They closed down the entire establishment according to state order. And lo and behold, Gillen is in that place. Now, the next day, Gillen is furious, along with being a little embarrassed. Right? And so he makes even more modifications to the state quarantine. All right? So now he says, if a restaurant were connected to a bar room, then only the bar ought to be closed. If restaurant patrons happen to order drinks with their meals, then that was perfectly allowable. Okay, but now what to do with the bars and saloons? So here's what Gillen orders. He says that saloons would be permitted to keep their side doors open for the sale of bottled whiskey based on a doctor's prescription. Well, what a reaction there was to that. The Newark Evening News called Gillen our side door mayor, stating what a crackerjack scheme and what a fine head was required to formulate it. The paper also accused Gillen of failing to rise to an emergency, but instead finding a way to be spectacular. Remember, I said he liked the limelight. Even the director of the New Jersey State Board of Health, Dr. Jacob Price, telegraphed the mayor's office stating information has reached this office that saloons in Newark are not closed in full accordance with the order of this department. For the protection of the state, this department insists on strict compliance with this order. Now keep in mind that in 1918, Newark had about 1,200 saloons, right? And all of them had their side doors opened, and it was nearly impossible to regulate what was happening here. So Gillen issued a strong statement against Newark Evening News, and stating and actually threatening to close down the paper. He says, attempts to interfere with any orders which I have issued or may issue for the preservation of the health of the people of Newark, I will close the paper immediately under the laws of the state as a menace to the public health, just as I would close any place of public assembly. So at this point, Gillen takes over Newark's health department as well. And he ordered its director, Dr. Charles Craster, whom you've heard of tonight, to report the latest numbers of influenza cases directly to the mayor's office instead of to the local newspapers. So in effect, Gillen is seizing control of all public information with regard to influenza gripping his city. Now, Gillen's thinking may have been due to something like this, and we really think that perhaps it was. He does have a certain amount of logic to why he made these modifications to the state quarantine. You have to remember, at this time, the Prohibition Amendment had just passed in the United States Congress, and there was a lot of pressure on the states to ratify this amendment. So for an independent like Gillen, right, whose thirsty constituents elected him to office, he sees the Republican-controlled state health initiative of closing places of public assembly, especially saloons, as an interdiction of alcohol. His thinking is, okay, if we close the saloons now, they may never reopen. And he was not about to stand for that. In the meantime, though, a crisis was looming in Newark. By October 21st of 1918, there were over 18,000 reported cases of influenza with over 800 deaths. And there were so many deaths that caskets lined the streets of Newark, especially along Springfield Avenue. Grave diggers at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery began digging trenches to bury the dead in mass graves. And all family members could do was kind of gaze through the wrought iron fence and watch their loved ones buried literally in just open pits. It's very sad. But Gillen strikes again. And on October 21st, he declared that the danger from influenza in his city had passed, and that the state quarantine in Newark is now revoked. Now, Gillen justified his action here in this decision by citing the latest numbers. Now remember, all numbers were now being reported to his office. He says, you know, on October 19th, there were 969 new cases of influenza, but you know what, on October 21st, there were only 550 new cases. Clearly, Newark is out of danger from influenza, is what his thinking is. At this point, there is just a massive state of confusion in Newark, right? Gillen had lifted the ban in Newark, but the state of New Jersey was nowhere near close to lifting the state quarantine. In fact, would not lift it for almost a week later. And Newarkers really didn't know if they should follow the state's quarantine, Gillen's modified quarantine with its side door policy, or the lifting of the ban altogether. Right? Now, within 4 days, physicians had reported over 22,000 cases of influenza with 1,000 deaths in less than 20 days. I mean, it's hard to imagine so much death all around you. At this point, though, once he issues this newest directive, the Newark Evening News, Gillen, the State Board of Health, even the Republican committee, all had their words to say. And the Newark Evening News had started by telling this story. It was rather a sarcastic editorial. And they start telling this story in the paper of a man who walks into the side door of a saloon. He's dejected, his head is down. He's telling the story of how he lost his daughter to influenza, and everybody is hanging their head low too, and they just can't figure out how this is ever going to stop. And the Newark Evening News ends the story with this little paragraph and says, well, the doctors weren't stopping the flu anyway. Maybe whiskey would. Someone had heard that it would. In fact, hadn't the mayor said that it would? Now, Gillen, of course, is the type of mayor who's going to have a response to this, and he says the news for some years past has attacked and undermined in every way the progress and growth of the city, and has attempted to give the city a bad name whenever anything occurred that would attract the attention of the outside world. The president of the State Board of Health, William Crew, commented, the mayor is setting a bad example for the whole state, and the action of Mayor Gillen must not pass unchallenged. Not to be outdone, Mayor Gillen stated these medical authorities of the state, I understand, ride into their meetings on loads of hay. Our medical men know more in 5 minutes than they will know in 100 years. And essentially, he is calling the physicians of the State Board of Health a bunch of hayseeds, right? The State Republican Committee had his words to say. He says, you know, it occurs to me that Mayor Gillen's efforts to make political capital of a very cheap variety out of so serious a situation as the influenza pandemic ill becomes the chief executive of a great city like Newark. Even the Newark Evening News would continue with its editorials. A man who would use his power with a lack of caution in such a case, whether simply because he has that power or for the purpose of making a display of it, is not a safe man in whom to repose authority over the citizens. But you know what? The people of Newark were much too busy caring for the sick, burying the dead, to pay attention to this bantering back and forth. Like I said, Newark lost almost 2,200 people to influenza in about 5 weeks. It was a horrible time for the people of Newark. And even if you compare some of the numbers with Newark and New York City, and by the way, that's just Manhattan and under the Newark part, the number of deaths based on the number of cases of influenza was 8% in Newark versus 7% in Manhattan. And so the percentage of deaths is even higher in Newark, and yet Newark was a much smaller city, and still is. So Gillen's handling of the pandemic, like I said, nearly 10% of the state's influenza deaths occurred in Newark. And it caused me to question, could Gillen have prevented these deaths if he had closed down all places of public assembly? You know, both Rupert Blue of the United States Public Health Service and Governor Walter Edge of New Jersey ordered quarantines on all places of public assembly. But it was Gillen who disregarded these rules and hierarchies by implementing modified versions of the ban, such as his side door policy. Gillen was playing politics with disease. Gillen wanted nothing to do with quarantines to prevent the spread of influenza if that meant closing drinking establishments during the throes of prohibition, and if that meant jeopardizing his political standing within his constituency. Gillen secured very little infrastructure to people to prepare for a public health emergency. He opposed the wishes of the State Board of Health. He interfered with work at the state level to combat influenza, and he engaged in a war of words instead of spending his time combating the disease. And I question, could Gillen's political ambitions, his mismanagement of the influenza pandemic, and his lack of interest in combating the disease have played a part in the concentrated number of deaths in Newark? I want you to imagine if Gillen had secured more medical personnel to care for the people of Newark, if he had opened more hospitals, if he had enforced the state's quarantine in Newark, and if he had set aside his political views. Could Gillen have saved more lives? And in my belief, I do believe he could have. And ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your interest in this topic, because the story shows how the actions of one individual could have determined the fate of many. And there's a powerful lesson to be learned here as we go into our future and possibly have to deal with yet another medical outbreak. So I thank you again for your interest.
Widespread use of disinfectants such as Lysol and new concepts of the hygienic home sheltered middle and upper class children from exposure to many germs and may have left them relatively non-immune to polio. Paralytic polio, paradoxically, sometimes seemed to be a disease of cleanliness, a point driven deep into the American consciousness when patrician Franklin Delano Roosevelt contracted paralytic polio in 1921. On July 1st, 1916, New York's Commissioner of Health alerted Dr. Charles Craster, Newark's vigilant health officer — you'll be hearing more about Dr. Craster from Jennifer later on — to an outbreak of polio in New York City. The first death of in Newark came on July 4th in the 10th Ward. The dead toddler's father worked as an express truck cart driver, delivering packages between Brooklyn and Newark. When poliomyelitis struck the United States in 1916, the hardest hit city in the nation per capita was Newark. The incidence rate — there were many more cases in New York, of course, but per capita, Newark, the incidence per capita was 3.3 per thousand population, compared to New York City with 1.8 cases per thousand population. A new and powerful virus, wrote Craster, was at work among a susceptible population. In the Newark Evening News and the Newark Sunday Call, terms such as scourge and plague would come to dominate the headlines, words that spoke to the hearts of a terrified public. The papers attempted to convey a sense of organization, of something parents could do to protect their children, and of a city government armed for battle. But the fine print revealed alarm among officials and growing fears among the public. Dr. Josephine Baker, the dynamic director of New York's Bureau of Child Hygiene, commented on the public hysteria so typical of epidemic polio. I have been through many epidemics, but I have never before experienced an epidemic of fear such as this has been. Newark's German language newspaper reported on the Kinderleben, literally children's lameness. New York's Yiddish newspaper referred to the angel of death, the Malach HaMovis, evoking images of a biblical plague. As often happens in an epidemic, outsiders who flee an area where the disease is active are viewed with suspicion or open hostility at their destination. Newark found itself on both sides of this dynamic. A family from a Brooklyn apartment house with polio cases, found no welcome with relatives in Newark. A neighbor told a reporter, "We are all afraid of them, and unless the Board of Health takes immediate action, we as a body of citizens are going to see that those people leave the neighborhood." This was all one ethnicity in which this occurred. Those people were the infected people. A parallel case occurred just a few days later, as South Orange took legal action against a couple who arrived with their baby from an infected area in Newark. Local officials gave the family a few hours to leave town. In the face of an epidemic that was killing and crippling children, public health decisions had to be made quickly, despite limited information and the certainty that the rights and freedoms of ordinary citizens would be abridged. Public health is not a democracy. The epidemic began in the crowded tenement wards of Italian, German, Russian, Polish, and Eastern European Jewish immigrants. By August, all 16 wards, including the wealthiest, reported cases of polio. Among the victims was the daughter of a Board of Health physician. Craster observed that, quote, "no nationality or condition of social life was exempt from infection." And that's just for, I think that's just for August. The black lines are the deaths, and the hatched lines are the incidence of cases. When expert consultation was needed, the diagnostician of the Newark Board of Health accompanied less experienced local physicians to the bedsides of sick children. The major impediment to correct early diagnosis was the lack of a practical laboratory test. Spinal tap could confirm inflammation, but was not specific to polio. Once neurological symptoms developed, the diagnosis could be made with more confidence. Craster immediately ordered a 6-week quarantine period for the entire family of an affected child, complete isolation of the patient in a separate room with a dedicated attendant, and terminal disinfection of the premises at the end of quarantine or after the child's death or removal to a hospital. Later, it was decided that with proper isolation in the home, the wage earner could be free to work. And this is the incidence by ward. It is difficult for us to imagine the burdens of quarantine on poor families who live for as much as 6 to 8 weeks, in sweltering weeks, behind the placard tacked to their door or tenement. I could not find one from Newark. This is from, I think, North Arlington. Tenement families unable to provide a private room were required by order of the health commissioner to release the child for transport by ambulance to the Essex County Isolation Hospital in neighboring Belleville. Parental presence on isolation units was forbidden, so that parents knew their child might die among strangers. Most infectious cases were not admitted to most general hospitals. They had nothing to treat them with. They didn't want them. These hospitals were set up to treat people with scarlet fever and smallpox and polio, well, not polio so much, typhoid and that kind of thing. Understandably, people turned to folk medicine and old wives' tales in the face of an epidemic. Children were seen wearing bags of gum camphor around their necks to repel the disease. Physician Huckster from Trenton promoted his secret regenerative serum, good for any malady, to desperate parents. It was made from blood serum, so he was probably busy spreading hepatitis while he was at it. The The lavish use of disinfectants such as Lysol may have been partially effective. Frequent hand washing does not seem to have been promoted to the public or actually to health providers. An energetic cleanup campaign of one heavily affected ward had little impact on the incidence of polio. Attacks on garbage and flies, if nothing else, may have relieved some of the misery of that hot and humid summer. In nearby South Orange, stray dogs and cats were captured and put to death, a measure used extensively in the thousands in New York City. In every issue, the Newark Evening News and the Weekly Sunday Call reported the actions of the health department, new case reports by address, hospitalizations and deaths, in some cases giving the names and addresses of newly reported and deceased children. I don't have an example of that here, but you can see the multi-ethnicity of the children who were affected and who died. By early August, the crowded wards and hurriedly constructed temporary barracks at the County Isolation Hospital could no longer accept new polio cases from Newark. Newark City Hospital quickly fitted up a just-completed new wing with children's cots and hired nursing staff, all strictly segregated from the rest of the hospital. Needless to say, there was some difficulty in attracting a nursing staff. Dr. Daniel Elliott and his staff at City Hospital treated 580 cases with 25% mortality. Remember, the pre-epidemic mortality was 4%. This was a very virulent strain, 25% mortality. Half the survivors had some degree of paralysis on discharge. Of 13 adults admitted to the hospital, 5 died and 7 survivors had extensive paralysis. No nurses or ward maids, as they were called, were infected. Elliott didn't need statistical analysis to reach the gloomy conclusion that all attempted treatments were useless. Removal of a small volume of spinal fluid seemed to reduce headache and irritability, possibly by relieving pressure on the brain and spinal cord. The standard hospital regimen was complete rest with the mobilization of paralyzed limbs for 5 or 6 weeks. And as you recall, there were no iron lungs at that point. August 14th was appointed as a visiting day at Newark Hospital. Visiting meant that some 3,500 family members thronged hospital grounds as nurses brought children to the windows. They were not allowed on the wards. The older children could wave and blow kisses. These images, by the way, are from the Newark Evening News, and courtesy of the librarians at Newark City Public Library, who have the images from the newspaper. They don't have the newspapers, that's a microfilm, but they have the images, and they found this for me. It's wonderful. A glimpse of their baby and waves from below had to suffice for parents of the youngest patients. Parents whose children were too sick to be brought to the window were sent home. Epidemics present challenges well beyond the immediate medical crisis. Decisions must be made despite incomplete data and limited scientific knowledge. The problem of summer school closings was thrashed out, that's the newspaper word, at meetings of the boards of health and education early in the epidemic. Health Officer Craster favored immediate summer school closings at the beginning of the epidemic and delayed opening as the epidemic petered out in the fall. That's because people returning to Newark as children returning to Newark from summer holidays might bring the disease with them. School officials insisted that 25,000 summer school students would be better off under the supervision and monitoring of teachers and nurses, and they were probably right. As things stood in late July, all summer school grades under the 5th were canceled, with a delayed opening in the fall. Dr. William Disbrow, president of the Board of Health, summarized the dilemma. While we may be foolish if we close all the schools, we may be criminal if we don't. Restrictions on children's summer activities began to appear just a week after the first death in Newark. The goal was to keep susceptible children from congregating and transmitting the virus. Prompted by Health Officer Craster, city agencies closed playgrounds, libraries, and public parks. Children under age 16 were barred from moving picture shows, photo play theaters, and vaudeville, though I didn't know children went to vaudeville. Okay. Craster's order barring children from the Barnum and Bailey Circus, due to roll into town in mid-July, prompted a reporter to refer sadly to a childless circus. In August, inspectors reported that many children were attending baseball games. The Board of Health ordered the police department to exclude the children or stop the games. Far more problematic than school and theater closings was Craster's order early in the epidemic to close children's clinics, day nurseries, dispensaries, and mothers' consultation stations. The rationale was to keep children, some of whom would likely be incubating polio, from transmitting the disease to susceptible children in the crowded waiting room of a clinic or the enclosed space of a day nursery. Newark's distinguished pediatrician, Henry Lieber Coit, founder of Babies Hospital, favored reopening schools, clinics, day nurseries, and mother's consultation stations. The goal, in his view, was to keep children under expert eyes rather than isolating them at home. However, Craster's closure orders prevailed. This was a burden on working mothers who depended on the day nurseries, and sometimes mothers were reported in the paper just leave their 8-year-old in charge of the 6-year-old and the 2-year-old with some bread and milk for the rest of the day. Efforts to control the movements of children both within the state and at the borders proved to be a summer-long bureaucratic nightmare that absorbed much of the energy of state and local authorities. It was customary for families of means to leave the city for shore and rural retreats. 2 weeks into the epidemic, Newark, like other towns throughout the state, issued certificates of health to children who were traveling from the city with their families. Certificates issued by the Newark Board of Health required a doctor's attestation that children of the family were free of symptoms of poliomyelitis. Many of these apparently healthy children, however, were asymptomatic carriers of the virus, and some would develop symptomatic polio and no doubt spread some polio at their summer destination because they were still infectious. By late July, a patchwork of regulations had sprung up as each municipality guarded its gates. Some travelers with proper certificates were turned back at train stations. Highlands in Monmouth County prohibited all Newark travelers from entering its town limits, put them back on the train, and sent them back to Newark. On September 3rd, Craster cautiously predicted that the backbone of the epidemic locally is broken. Sunday, September 24th, was a remarkable day, the first since July 5th, without a single report of a new case. July would end with a total of 327 cases and 97 deaths. A brutal August saw 883 cases and 226 deaths. The worst single day of the entire summer was August 4th, with 45 new cases and 13 deaths. It's kind of sort of self-evident, a little hard to follow the details, but those are the cases and the deaths throughout the summer. The epidemic lost force in September, small comfort for 150 families with newly afflicted children, of whom 40 would die. Infants and children aged 4 or less accounted for 85% of cases. There were few adult cases, which tended to be much more statistically serious or fatal. For some 600 children in Newark, the epidemic lingered on in paralyzed limbs and for many stunted futures. In August, a citizens group anticipated the need for rehabilitation of these survivors. The Newark Evening News raised $25,000 in public donations to support the Citizens Health Committee. The paper referred to the children as a small, lame army. Newark pediatrician Coit became the tireless guiding force behind what was called the aftercare program. The subcommittee's remarkable extra-governmental initiative to provide organized rehabilitation for survivors with residual paralysis was the most lasting legacy of Newark's 1916 polio epidemic. Aftercare work was expected to last 18 months to 2 years. The program was a cooperative effort. The Bureau of Associated Charities and the Visiting Nurse Association offered their services. 100,000 pamphlets, written by Coit and translated into 4 languages, were printed gratis by the Prudential Insurance Company. The committee's office in the United Charities building housed a clerical staff. A uniform system of record keeping was set up to prevent fraud and provide accurate data for statistical analysis. Children discharged from the County Isolation Hospital and the Newark City Hospital were evaluated by the committee's nurses for home or hospital care and private or charitable clinic follow-up. Braces for all children, including private patients, were paid for by the committee. Transport to clinic appointments was provided when necessary. Specially trained nurses made regular home visits to evaluate progress, conduct therapy, and educate mothers in rehabilitation procedures. The Home for Crippled Children in Newark Babies Hospital reserved beds for children requiring inpatient aftercare, and in some cases corrective surgery. Corrective surgery consisted of transplanting tendons from unaffected areas to areas that were affected. It was an idea of sort of moving the tendon so the joint would move. Since the incubation period was long over, home care and hospitalized children were not infectious and did not require isolation. During the first weeks of paralysis, the emphasis was on rest and immobilization of affected limbs. And you can see on the right there's a mother visiting her child who's getting some sort of heat lamp treatment, which probably made the providers feel good, but probably did very little for the children. Once over the acute stage, basic modalities included massage, splinting, casting, hydrotherapy, a range of electrical muscle stimulating techniques, and, quote, muscle education. Late in convalescence, a minority of children underwent orthopedic surgery to improve function, stabilize joints, or reduce deformity. On March 12, 1917, just a few months after the end of the polio epidemic and the beginning of aftercare work, Coit died at age 62. His front-page obituary suggested that overwork in the aftercare program contributed to his death. As the years went on, New Jersey saw increasing cases of polio. This is statewide, not city, with occasional spikes during epidemic years. You can see there's some years when it exceeds 1,000. Though none approached the 4,000 cases statewide in the 1916 epidemic. All that changed in 1955 with the introduction of the polio vaccine. And perhaps we even have a few polio pioneers in the audience. Do we have any polio pioneers? Do I see? Those were children, yes? Whose parents volunteered them for early immunization trials.
Oh, wow.
But that is a story for another day, and I think it's pretty clear what happened when the Salk vaccine was introduced. And I'm sure many of us remember the joy that our parents had and lining up in school for shots. which terrified us. Thank you.
Well, that was an interesting video. As you can tell, some time has passed because the lighting has changed. And mask is done. So, as you can see, New Jersey, Newark in particular, has gone through its fair share of epidemics or pandemics, but the city, just like the state, has always been able to pull its way through. As you can see, we had not such a great mayor that first time around. Well, yeah, well, depends on your definition of great. Because he did want to keep the economy going, and so he did different things to help keep the economy going, but he didn't seem to have too much care. So, yeah, win some, lose some. The main thing is, though, we got through it. This is a big mask. Yeah. But we got through it, and we will get through it again. That's the main takeaway from all of this. Also, if you want to get the diagram of how to make your own mask at home, feel free to send me a message or just leave a comment down below with your email or something, or contact us on Instagram, and we'll be more than happy to send you the cutout or whatever to make your own mask. In fact, I'm going to put the website that we got it from in the comments. But thank you so much for watching. If you like what you see, please like and subscribe. Don't be afraid. Just be safe. Wash your hands. Live your life. And bye, Bookends.